Hi, everybody. This is Eve Harrow, and you're listening to Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. It is Friday, September 13th, 2019, and the 13th day of Elul, 5779. And I am very honored to be sitting in Jerusalem at the beautiful Orient Hotel with Michael Medved, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, if not all of you. He's got a 3-hour daily radio show that boggles the mind, and is about to publish in November his 14th book, God's Hand on America. So, Michael, thank you so much for making time to sit with me this morning. I know you're here leading a group, and I saw them down in the lobby. They were going off to the Israel Museum, and so I had a few minutes to sit with you. So welcome to Jerusalem.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and such a glorious day, and it's Erev Shabbat, and what could be better?
So tell us a little bit. I mean, you have such a CV. You've been doing so much for so many years. You were at Robert Kennedy's assassination. I mean, your history.
I know. I don't want President Trump to think that I was secretly part of it.
Oh,
like Ted Cruz's father. No, I was a Robert Kennedy volunteer when I was a teenager, and I had taken a leave of absence from college at Yale to go out there and campaign for Robert Kennedy. So I was there for what was supposed to be the victory celebration. And that actually is part of my new book, because the last chapter begins with that episode, which is obviously one of the most dramatic things that you can ever witness, which is a history-changing event just feet away from you, and a horrible history-changing event. And by the way, Robert Kennedy was a victim of Palestinian terror.
Yeah.
And Sirhan, who is still alive, who has schools and playgrounds named after him in the Palestinian Authority. Sirhan was as clear as he could be, that he believed that he was serving the cause of, quote, justice for Palestine by murdering this extremely hopeful politician for the United States. In any event, right after the assassination, the novelist John Updike said, "I now believe that God has withdrawn his special blessing from America." And my last chapter argues against that. That if you look at everything that has happened to America since 1968, in particular, which is a good time, I mean, it's 51 years ago, those last 51 years, which have been turbulent, dramatic, eventful, have been phenomenally good years for the United States and for the world, certainly for Israel. And that's the other amazing thing. If you think about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, Robert Kennedy died because he had publicly advocated selling, not giving, selling phantom jets to the Israeli government. In 1968, that recently, and all during the June War, Israel did not have American equipment. Right. They had to fly French planes, which, hate to say it, are not as good. Yeah. But the Israelis did amazing and fine with it. But the point about all this is, anyone looking at the last 50 years of American history, American Jewish history in particular, you could say, but American history in general, to believe that the country is falling apart or is moving downward, or that we're on the edge of apocalypse. My last chapter in my book is called Forever Upward, which is a phrase from Franklin D. Roosevelt's fourth inaugural address, where he talks about the general direction of civilization and human beings, and perpetually rising, their peaks, their values, but the general, Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I believe that's true, and I believe that's
true.
Without question. Look, when Robert Kennedy was killed, and just going back then as a 50-year period of time, the situation in the United States was so awful. We were losing, literally, and this is not an exaggeration, it's the truth, there were weeks where we lost 400 young men in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there were terrible riots at American universities. At the University of Wisconsin, radicals blew up the math building and killed a graduate student who was just working in the math building at the University of Wisconsin. We had urban riots in over 200 American cities with thousands of injured people and almost 1,000 dead people. This is an American Civil War going on. The level of trouble and suppression and ugliness involving race in America was incomparably worse than it is today. And the rise in the standard of living, the rise in educational opportunity. In 1969, right, when I graduated from college, it's a while ago, there were fewer than 10% of Americans had a 4-year college degree. And there are statistics as low as 5%, 95% not college graduates. Today, it's almost a majority of younger people. At 35%, if you take the country at large, have college degrees. Now, that's not like a college degree is a passport to Halam Haba or to the world to come or anything like that. But what it does do is it opens up opportunities. And the range of opportunities for Americans, for Israelis, for people around the world to enjoy all the beautiful things that God has made for us in the world. The advance of religious liberty everywhere. Do you know, I mean, I know that I think a lot of the people who listen to your podcast are Christian, right? Yes. Do you know what the second largest Christian nation is in America in terms of people who identify as faithful Christians? America's the largest by far because it's most of our 330 million people in America. Second place?
South America?
China.
Really?
Yes, minimum of 160 million Christians.
That's an interesting fact.
No, it's changed the world.
Wow.
Because that has driven Chinese prosperity. The largest churches in the world, all of them, 4 of them, are in South Korea. And again, and I'm one of those people who I believe passionately in freedom and choice and people being able to find their own path and live their own lives. The advance of liberty has been spectacular, unbelievable. I never believed. I mean, I knew because my grandparents came from Ukraine. And if you remember, and you may not be old enough, but there was...
I love hearing sentences like that.
But there was a time when every synagogue and temple in America had a sign on it that said, "Save Soviet Jewry."
I remember.
And I remember I once knew a young lady, a teenager, who said, "What's so special about Soviet jewelry?" Yeah, no.
But speaking of jewelry, I wore a bracelet for years that said Silva Zalmanson on it, who was one of the Soviet Jews who was trapped behind the Iron Curtain, a refusnik. And until she got out, I kept that bracelet on. So there is something to the jewelry aspect of it. It was a plastic bracelet, though, as I recall.
Okay, but you look at what that mass migration of people has meant, what it's meant to Israel.
Well, it's driven our high tech here. I mean, it's done. Not to mention, we've got philharmonics in places like Beersheba, world class philharmonics in physics and math. It's totally changed the face of the country.
And a lot better chess players.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no. I mean, and it's not just Israel. The American Jewish community has benefited significantly from some of the Russians who've come to the United States. But it's. And really, when people are talking about the world being perched on the edge of apocalypse and things falling apart and they're getting more horrible, I mean, my goodness, get a grip.
So you're giving an extraordinarily positive worldview right now. And I'm wondering, and I'm glad that you brought up the chaos of the late 60s, because a lot of people are just thinking about Woodstock. You know, it's 50 years and there's this kind of hazy, rosy, everybody was having sex and smoking pot vision of what was happening at the end of the 60s. And you're bringing it down to earth a little bit. So I want to throw out a slightly maybe provocative question. Before 1967 and the Six-Day War, America was not in Israel's sphere. Israel was very much alone for the first 19 years of our existence. Do you think that prosperity and what you're describing now, the last 50 years of tremendous American achievement, is possibly linked to its friendship with Israel? And I know this is maybe an unfair question, especially to ask someone who's a person of faith and very involved in his Judaism. How do you see, has that connection done for either country, but specifically for America?
For both. It has been an unparalleled blessing. The most controversial chapter in my new book, which is the central chapter, it's right in the middle, and it's one of the two longest chapters, is called The Abrahamic Advantage. And it relates to Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, 12:3, where there's a promise made to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham, our forefather, and the promise is that for your children, those who bless you will themselves be blessed, and those who curse you will themselves be cursed. And it is impossible to look at the history of the 20th century. It's impossible to look at the history of the 19th century without seeing that operative principle. And part of what I write about in my chapter is the basic thesis of the book is that in terms of the emergence of the United States, and you could say the same thing about the emergence of the modern state of Israel, it is impossible to attribute it to coincidence, to random evolution. It shows intelligent design. And there clearly is a pattern here. And the pattern with the arrival of 2.5 million destitute Russian Empire Jews between 1881 and 1924, when they shut down the immigration, that mass migration has had everything to do with the America's emergence as the number one power in the world. America was not, by anyone's imagination, number one power in the world, or even really in the top three in 1881. By 1924, when they cut down the Jewish immigration, everything had changed. It is no accident that that period of time when, by the way, the beginnings of American Zionism were with Christians, not with Jews. And again, it's something that we ought to acknowledge. One of the figures in my book is this amazing gentleman, and he truly was a gentleman, and may his memory be a blessing, named William Eugene Blackstone, excuse me. And William Eugene Blackstone he described himself as God's little errand boy. He was a successful businessman who wrote a book called Jesus is Coming, which became a colossal bestseller. But part of the book was he believed that the sign that Jesus was coming is he could feel it. Now, this book came out in 1886, right? It's a long time ago. And before Herzl on the First Zionist Conference in 1897, and before Herzl had even discovered this dream of a Jewish state, he went to Israel with this Christian guy, no Jewish background, no Jewish ancestry, Christian guy. He went to Israel and he became obsessed with this dream of the Jews returning to their homeland. And listen to this. He put together in 1888, 2 years after his book, and he's a national celebrity because of the success of his book, he put together what's called the Blackstone Memorial, which is a petition to the President of the United States. He was invited to the White House to present it to President Benjamin Harrison and to Secretary of State James Gillespie Blaine. And the Blackstone Memorial was signed by J.P. Morgan, the leading banker in America, not Jewish, Andrew Carnegie, U.S. Steel. It was signed by William McKinley, who was a future president, was then a member of Congress. It was signed by 20 U.S. senators, leading industrialists. It was endorsed by 90 newspapers, including all the major newspapers. And what did it say? It asked President Harrison to use America's military might, its navy and its armies, to help lead the Jewish people back to their homeland and to liberate Zion. And there's a very touching story that honestly, it amazes me that Jewish people don't know about, where Blackstone lived until 1939. So he saw a lot of what he prophesied, because he prophesied that it was necessary to get the Jews out of Europe for their safety. And he corresponded with Theodor Herzl. And when Herzl did organize the first Zionist conference, Blackstone wrote to him, and he sent Herzl a copy of his English language Bible, and highlighted with all of the parts about, Jews come back to their homeland. And after Herzl died, he received correspondence from his close associate families. You know that Herzl kept a copy of your Bible on his desk, and you can actually see it in one of the photographs of Herzl in his office.
Wow. That's an amazing story, really. And did he know Jabotinsky? Did he know, Rabbi Kook? Did he know some of the people from the Jewish side who were also saying the European Jewry is doomed?
The one he did know, and who met several times with Blackstone, was Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis, of course, was, and again, it's a heroic figure, and most Americans don't know this. Whatever you think of Brandeis's politics or his work on the Supreme Court, and he is one of the most distinguished justices of the Supreme Court ever, first Jewish person appointed to that kind of truly important position, appointed by President Wilson in 1913. In any event, Louis Brandeis was an unabashed Zionist very early, and wrote about it, and he made the case that, look, I am the most patriotic American you'll ever meet, but I'm also a great believer that America should be involved with helping to facilitate a homeland for the Jews. Now, look, this is the amazing thing, and I want to get back to this because you can go back to John Adams, second president of the United States. Even before John Adams, Cotton Mather, who was the son of a president of Harvard, was the leading Puritan scholar in the colonial period. These were people who believed, there's a signer of the Declaration of Independence that nobody's ever heard of called Elias Boudinot. These were people who believed that the new country they were involved in launching, the United States of America, that God was helping them because the purpose of the United States of America was to lead the Jews back to their land. Wow. John Adams, the President of the United States, thought that to be true. And there are all these early, and again, one of the photographs in my book, and I worked hard to get it, is the only known photograph we have of this remarkable person who is buried on Har HaZeitim.
On the Mount of Olives here in Jerusalem. On
the Mount of Olives. And I am hoping that when my book, God's Hand on America, comes out, that his undeserved obscurity will come to an end. It's an absolutely remarkable figure. The first one to talk about rebuilding Israel. And this is in 1847. Wow. 1847. He talks about we're only going to be able to rebuild Israel by training Jews as farmers. And he bought a tract of property in Jerusalem to create what he called a scientific farm that would use the advanced techniques of agronomy. He had become a wealthy man. He owned 60,000 acres of farms in Pennsylvania. The guy's name was Warder Cresson. He was the first ever consul general from the United States to Jerusalem. Okay, here's the thing. He was appointed in 1844. He came over here. The farm that he bought, my brother lives on that property today.
You must be kidding.
It's Emek Rephaim.
Wow. And we're sitting on it. I mean, the hotel we're on right now is on Emek Rephaim.
Tract of land here where he was trying to teach Jews. Now, one of the reasons we know about his opinions is Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, great American writer, comes over to Jerusalem and stays with Warder Cresson. They probably argued and argued and argued. And Melville said, "You're crazy, you're nuts. The Jewish people are a dead people. They will never come back to this land." And Cresson, okay, here's the thing about him. He was a fervently religious guy. He was raised a Quaker. He became briefly a Mormon, an early Mormon, a follower of Joseph Smith. He left that. He became a Baptist. When he came over to America, when he came over to Israel, he was more in the Baptist vein. But he was fascinated by the Hebrew language. And when he was consul general, he immediately contacted the Rabbanut and the Sephardic Rabbanut because he thought that was more authentic.
And this is under the Ottoman Empire.
Correct. He became consul general in 1844. He died in 1860. During that 16 years he was in Israel, he started to learn because he wanted to end this Sephardic rabbinate welcomed him. And then in 1848, 4 years after he arrived, he writes in his diary, "Today is the most important day of my life. I underwent the holy rite of circumcision." Wow. And he became Michoel Boaz Yisrael.
So he officially converted to Judaism.
Not just that, he went into Rabbanus. Wow. And
he became a rabbi.
Consul General. Wait, I'll show you the picture, but it's an amazing thing. And he kept writing these pamphlets. And he wrote a pamphlet about the coming Holocaust that he said in the next century. And that why it's urgent to get Jews back to our land. Now, he is the first person that we know of to actually publish something using the term Holocaust.
Wow, what a story.
This is, again, 100 years before it happens. Right. And again, his funeral in Jerusalem, he became a beloved figure here. And his funeral apparently drew 10,000 people.
Which Jerusalem at the time, that was probably the entire population or close to it.
The population, about half the population. Wow. And again, it's someone who is, they recently, they thought that his grave was lost. And only recently, I think it's 2013, they identified, and there are a number of people who made contributions so that his gravestone could be.
Right. Well, the Jordanians post-48 destroyed a good part of the Mount of Olives cemetery, and I imagine that his grave was one of them. That's interesting, because when you first said that he was buried there, it's a Jewish cemetery. Right. So I'm thinking, okay, so there was a Christian buried in the Mount of Olives, and then you went on to explain. That's an incredible story. So what happens then, though? Because FDR, who my grandfather thought, well, I mean, so many Jews thought FDR would, like, walked on water, if you'll excuse the expression, and then it turns out that he didn't do what he could have to save Jewry, and even Harry Truman had to be convinced to recognize the state of Israel. So when it's all right there and not just an idea, somehow the top people in the American government, the presidents, are not where these guys were a few decades before. What happened?
Well, and again, what you were saying about Harry Truman is Truman was religiously motivated in defying his Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, and in defying conventional political opinion and calling for the recognition of Israel at a time that it was very controversial. The one thing that Truman did not do is allow any shipments of arms, which would have made a huge difference and would have certainly been at least every bit as consequential as his recognition of Israel.
But we're talking about in 1948, when 1% of the Jewish population here is killed in our War of Independence, which is an outrageous number.
No, exactly right. You want to, it's at least 2% of the male population. Because, and not that women didn't fight, of course, but predominantly of the 6,000 people who died fighting for Israeli independence, they were almost all men. In any event, your question is a profound and important one, and I think that one can associate some of the darkness that occurred in the United States in the late 60s. With precisely that. Now, I don't want to be reductionist. I'm not simplistic. And I've studied history a lot. That's my 14th book, and many of my previous books, including 10 Big Lies About America and Right Turns, and really are, I think, probe pretty deeply into history. But just to put it in the simplest terms possible, when Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State for Lyndon Johnson, said that the United States, and this is in May of 1967, right before the June War, the United States will be neutral in thought, word, and deed. How can you be neutral between people who want to commit genocide and say so, as the Egyptians did, as the Syrians did?
As Iran is saying today.
Correct. There's no neutrality between people who want to perpetrate genocide and people who want to defend their lives. I mean, this is not a neutral situation. That period, and really beginning with the Robert Kennedy, and well, actually beginning with the John Kennedy assassination, it's a dark period for America. It's a period of Dr. King's assassination. There's a chapter about Dr. King in my new book as well. And where America suffered horribly, and people forget, as you say, they think of Woodstock. Mm-hmm. They don't think the same week as Woodstock, you had the Manson murders, which are not just a Hollywood story. This is sick, it's grisly. He had started an evil cult, Charles Manson, and with more than 100 followers. And he did, not just the ones who are in jail. And America went into this terrible situation, and then America's coming out of that situation, including Robert Kennedy being killed after calling for the sale of the Phantom jets to Israel. It began to come out of that situation very dramatically with, and I'll tell you one sign is, do you know what happened on July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial? There's a little operation in Entebbe. Yeah. And all of a sudden, we elected, and I still believe Ronald Reagan and his election was a gigantic landmark for America in terms of putting, remember Reagan ran and won re-election with the slogan, it was morning in America. And Reagan was spared miraculously from death when he took a bullet in the heart. If they had made a different turn, Reagan wanted to go back to the White House. He was conscious and he was bleeding profusely, and again, the bullet was less than an inch from his heart. And he was countermanded by the Secret Service, said, no, Mr. President, we can't take you to the White House. He said, I want to go to the White House. I want to see Nancy. And I said, no. They took him to the hospital. Mm-hmm. If they had gone to the White House and listened to him, he would not have lived. Okay, so this changes, and we have the most pro-Israel president in history, and I still believe that President Reagan deserves that title. And
really? Not Jimmy Carter? Being facetious.
Jimmy Carter. Yeah. That's a complicated story. But in any event, when you think about it, and I was just mentioning this before, growing up as, like most American Jews, about 80% of the American Jewish population is people who come from Eastern Europe, who come from the Russian Empire, what used to be Poland, and most of whom is Polish Jews. Poland used to be part of Russia. People who come from that part of the world. Including my grandparents who came over 100 years ago to the United States? Of course, and my grandparents who came from Ukraine in 1910, my grandfather in 1924, my grandmother. They were separated by war and revolution and horrors, which I tell that story elsewhere. But the point is that what you're dealing with here is such an unbelievable vision. When you were younger, no one could imagine that the evil empire would go away. Yeah. When people talked about someday the captive nations of Poland would be free, and Poland obviously has a long history of anti-Semitism. But if you look at the relationships, even in Hungary, one thing about Prime Minister Netanyahu is he has built up surprisingly strong relationships with some tough customers. Oh, yeah. People like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban in Hungary. And it's important. But you think about it, the term elections in Poland, elections in Hungary, where the elections are either da or death. Right. Yeah, I mean, these are remarkable moments. And then again, if you look at just the circumstances of life in America, one thing that most people are unaware of, people are very aware that we have a very high cost of medical care. Mm-hmm. We have a medical care system that is messed up. We could learn a lot from Israel, where my father, having lived the last 19 years of his life here, my brother having been here for 35 years with his family. I'm privileged to have known your father, amazing man, and to know your brother. Yes. Thank you. Family of overachievers, by the way. I just want to throw that in there. Well, thank you. I'm very, very proud of my family and our children and grandchildren. But the point being that I had cancer, and I had throat cancer, which is kind of ironic for somebody who makes his living talking on the radio. I had to miss 11 weeks of my broadcast. I was diagnosed in December of 2014. And thank God I'm cancer-free. But that ability to cure that disease, when my grandfather, before I was born, was diagnosed with stomach cancer, he was dead in 2 months. And if you think about those changes, the additional life, I remember I clipped from the newspaper, the New York Times, there was a Hasidic businessman in Borough Park, and he passed away at age 98. And they had thousands of people who came to his funeral to honor him. He was a prodigious Baal Tzedakah. He gave a lot to charity. But here's the thing that stuck in my mind, is that his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren totaled more than 1,000. 1,000.
That's his big legacy.
No, and they said in the New York Times that, to the best of anyone's knowledge, all those more than 1,000 grandchildren and great-grandchildren were involved in Judaism, were observant, were committed, were on the derech. Now,
but would we say that now? Like, let's jump to 2019. Are you concerned with what's happening to Jewish life in America? Do you think that there's a loss of that connection to Judaism among the majority of Jews?
No, I think what's happening in Jewish life in America is amazing. I think there are more people in yeshivot than ever before in the history of the world. You look at 2 of our 3 children went to seminary, our daughter, and to yeshiva, our son, the year after graduating from Northwest Yeshiva High School. They came here to Eretz Yisrael. Do you realize there are thousands of kids? I believe they say now there are a total of 50,000 kids who have done that kind of program. That's an amazing thing. Kids who delay college when there's so much emphasis in the American Jewish world in going to college. And if you look at, I went to Yale years back, obviously, and I just went back to a reunion. And it's amazing to see the development of Jewish life there. The literally hundreds of people who are involved in kosher food, who are involved in big minyanim, and the idea, look, there's a certain kind of Judaism that I wouldn't say it's in trouble, I would say that it's evolving, which is the kind of Judaism that says, yes, I feel very Jewish, but I'm really not that involved. We'll go to a Passover Seder, we'll go to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Or marry a non-Jew.
Yeah, but even that, the level of conversion that is very serious, that is also phenomenally high. I don't think it's a bad thing that there are unprecedented numbers, and usually it's of secular Americans who are finding their way through the very rigorous, demanding process of Orthodox conversion. And if you look at American Jewish life, I'll just give you one number, which is an unbelievable thing. I am not a Chabadnik, but I'm a fellow traveler. Right. And I think we are all fellow travelers. I think we all benefit beyond what anyone realizes from the unbelievable good that Chabad does in the world.
I was just scholar in residence at a Chabad synagogue last week in Bell Harbor, and it was packed. So yes, you can see what they're doing.
Chabad congregations there are now in the state of Florida?
No, I have no idea.
117.
Wow.
Wait, listen, right. 117. Worldwide now, there are 3,700 Chabad houses. They're everywhere. They light a menorah in Red Square.
You're painting a rosy picture of American Jewry and of people either coming back to their Jewish roots or maintaining their Jewish roots and educating their children Jewishly. Probably about 300 of those kids who come to seminary were on the plane with me a couple of days ago, incidentally, mainly very chattery girls. But it was a pleasure to see. But where it involves Israel, there seems to be somewhat of now a disconnect or even criticism or even that's kind of the crazy uncle over there. Those are the occupiers. Those are the immoral Jews. And and people talk about this extensively, somewhat of a break now between the majority of American Jews and Israel. Do you see that?
Yes. Again, I would not say I'm painting a rosy picture. Mm-hmm. I want to paint an encouraging picture, which is different. And encouraging, rosy implies there's going to be a bright dawn and everything is going to be sunshine. Obviously, we're not in that situation.
It's a challenging period.
Yeah, and there is an upsurge in anti-Semitism in the United States. There's no question about it. And some of that anti-Semitism is from, it seems to me, purportedly Jewish groups. I am sickened by the activities of groups like J Street, Jewish Voices for Peace. Jewish Voices for Peace is the worst. They're anti-Semites, and they're miserable. However, you see, it's one of those things where I think part of what is happening here is that if you look at, going back again to that date, 1968, Robert Kennedy assassination, turning point for me, turning point for our country. If you look back before that date, kind of everybody was mildly pro-Israel, but it was easy because Israel was an underdog. And no one, today, I had on my radio show, which I'm doing from Jerusalem here, I had on George Gilder, who's a visionary writer and an unbelievable guy. His new book is called Life After Google. And he's one of those people who predicted everything from the iPhone, and a wonderful, wonderful writer. He said that without question, per capita, Israel is, and George is not Jewish, he says Israel is the economic powerhouse in high tech, in innovation. And the fact my brother Jonathan Medved loves to cite, which is that on the NASDAQ, which measures technological companies generally, Israel, the United States has the most companies, of course. China is second. Israel is third.
Which is incredible when you think about the size of the country and the size of the population, that we're anywhere in the top 400, right, let alone third.
Yeah, and my brother made the point. He was speaking in China, mainland China recently. He was speaking to a group of people who wanted to hear about Israeli high tech, and he said, "Look, it's really pretty amazing." He told that story about NASDAQ. And he said, and remember, Israel is only a country with 7 million Jews. And people applauded, and then their hand went up. And he said, are you telling me, and apparently thick accent, are you telling me Israel has only a population of 70 million? And Jonathan says, no, not 70 million. 7 million. And people couldn't believe it. They had a tough time believing it was only 70 million. Of course, there are 1.4 billion Chinese.
We go for quality over quantity. Yes.
Well, we go for hopefulness. And the one point over here, which is something, and it's something I'm going to speak about. When we're speaking right now, it's Erev Shabbat. And I have this group of 150 people who's here, and it's about 2/3 Christian, about 1/3 Jewish. And
they came with you, right? You're leading them around the country.
Correct, and co-sponsored with Discovery Institute, and which is a wonderful organization that fights for the idea of intelligent design, that there is a design to the universe, that you can use evolution to explain a great deal. I mean, how you go from amoebas evolving to Mozart. That's basically what evolution does. What evolution can't do, and this is the profound insight of Discovery Institute, there's no way that evolution or any rational, materialistic explanation can explain how you go from dead rock to something alive. We're alive in this moment. It's a miracle. Nes gadol haya po. I mean, and in any event, it's a great miracle happened right here. Anyway, the point being, to go back to the optimism of this, is that one of the things there's a photograph that moved me a great deal, and this is before I became religious. I'm proud to be the first member of our family, and kind of everybody has followed along now to be a Sabbath observer. And one of the things that influenced me was a photograph. It's a photograph by Jacob Riis, who was a journalist, Swedish-American, who wrote a powerful book of photographs and text called How the Other Half Lives. And it was about these destitute East European Jews who were crowded in the Lower East Side of Manhattan and just struggling to live. And there's a photograph he has, and the title is just Shabbat. And it shows this guy, long beard, youngish guy, who was living in a coal bin. The only place he had to live was in a coal bin, and he's sitting by this big pile of coal, and he's sitting on it. And there in front of him there's a little like placemat, and he has his 2 chalot, and he has a glass of wine.
Right. It's Shabbat.
In a coal bin. Yeah. And
well, they say that's what's kept us alive, is Shabbat. And I know now Christians who are starting to be Sabbath observers. I was just with them actually in Seattle a few days ago. So there's something about Shabbat that is just so special, especially, when you do it in the real way and create an atmosphere that is just so different from the rest of the week. But if you've connected the successes of America in the last half century with its connection to Israel, so then the flip side of it would be that if America, or some Americans, and not just American Jews, you're seeing politicians who are now not just pulling away from Israel, but turning anti-Israel. Does it worry you then that will have an effect on the health and well-being of America?
If those people were empowered, I don't think there's much of a political future for Rashida Tlaib or for Ilhan Omar, Yamach Shemo. I mean, Ilhan Omar, by the way, she is in a world of trouble with this scandal about misusing campaign funds, and we are very, very fortunate in the United States and the state of Israel particularly with our friends. We are even more fortunate with our enemies. I mean, because, once upon a time, America had formidable enemies. Stalin was formidable. Hitler was very formidable. Rashida Tlaib is not formidable. I'm sorry.
No, well, if you talk about outside enemies, we've got some pretty nasty characters, and they're not all that far from here.
Correct.
You have Iran, you have Erdogan, you even have Putin, who, I was just in St. Petersburg a few weeks ago. Yeah. And when people start talking to you there, they're not, it's still not Nebraska. There's a lot going on.
There is. But in terms of, again, formidable enemies, I remember it so clearly when it took a few heroic Americans, like the sainted Henry Jackson, to pry open the doors to the world's, at one point it was the world's largest Jewish community, was in the Russian Empire. But to open it up, it took heroic effort. And again, if you compare what America faces right now, once upon a time, we just had the 18th anniversary of September 11th, which we're here, broadcasting here when we celebrated it. That 18th anniversary of September 11th should give us some perspective, because at that moment when there were 3,000 Americans, many of them Jewish, of course, who were killed on September 11th, by this monstrous evil that was incredibly well organized, and the planes and hitting the buildings. How many Americans believed, including me, that there would be more? There would be other very, very high-profile cases of mass murder, and it would be a complete nightmare. There is no question that the Islamic jihadi craziness is in full retreat. And it is. And I'll give you an example. Once upon a time, and when I say once upon a time, 10 years ago even, and certainly 15 years ago, there was this idea that was very powerful in the Islamic world, that you would get rewarded with 72 virgins if you blew yourself up into little bloody chunks of flesh in order to murder innocent children. That idea is not even on the internet, even on their websites, that idea is less involved right now. Now, I'm not saying that the threat has gone away. Of course it hasn't. There are rockets that interrupted the prime minister the other night, and Hamas sends young people to their pointless deaths every Friday. I mean, God forbid it should be today, but it probably, I'm not.
And we have Hezbollah and we have Iran going nuclear. Like, the scale maybe is getting bigger. Maybe you don't have, and I would say also that Israeli intelligence has played a very big part in stopping a lot of the lone suicide bombers or homicide bombers, actually more correctly. But you have it on a state scale now. So that's, as an Israeli, and with elections coming up in just a few days, I mean, that's of major concern here. But to get back, it's been 18 years since 9/11, which means that American kids who are in college right now either weren't alive or don't even remember it.
Right.
And my question is, and this I find because I go to the States a lot, do American kids appreciate America? They understand what a great country it is, because unless you appreciate what you have and how much blood has been spilled to keep America great, something that we don't have the luxury of ever forgetting here in Israel because it's an ongoing, we really never came out of our war. But in the United States, if you don't appreciate what you have, you might lose it because you're not going to fight hard enough to keep it. How do you feel about American youth, not just Jewish youth, I'm saying in general, the American youth of today, because you've lived a tremendous span of history. You're a historian, but you've also lived a lot of it. Where do you see that now as compared to back in the 60s or in the 70s or, in different times in the United States history?
I think it's a huge problem. And you're right. I mean, I did a book in 2009 called The 10 Big Lies About America to counter the big lies that were all designed to foster guilt rather than gratitude. And again, to be an American, to be born in the United States of America, as I was fortunate enough to be, and to be born at this moment of history, I'm the luckiest generation ever. I mean, if you look at it in the Israeli capacity, my parents, I came to Israel for the first time when I was 6 months old. And I didn't choose it. I don't have any memories of it. My parents were considering making Aliyah. And they were both students. Mm-hmm. And they were both very young. My dad was 22 when I was born. Coming over here, they just couldn't make it. They couldn't get a telephone. They were basically living in tents. Israel
was a third world country then. I mean, we've gone from third world to first world in like a blink of an eye, but absolutely, it was incredibly difficult then.
It was a third world country that had just lost 2% of all its men who died in a war. And it was, and again, and you look today, when my wife and I came here, I took my wife here for the first time in 1985, right after we got married. To use a telephone, they used to have those slugs there that had that ridge in it that you had to use and put in.
The simonim with the hole in the middle, right?
It was a sign, right? A simonim. It was crazy. And here, Israel has the highest cell phone penetration in the world. Now, again, you look at this beautiful city, and you look at what Jerusalem was. Herman Melville, this goes back to my book, when he came to visit Warder Cresson, our consul general in Jerusalem, he wrote harshly, and he's a great writer, and he was very sympathetic to Jews, but he said, Jerusalem is like a rotting skull, and the Jews are like flies buzzing in and out through the eye sockets. Because this is Jerusalem in the 1840s. Right. Was not Yerushalayim.
It's very, very different today. But, before we started recording, we were talking about children and grandchildren, and that's a huge part of Judaism, is you don't just live for yourself, you build a family. And the Bible, I believe, is all about family and the importance of faith and family to civilization. So you are clearly so grateful to have lived your life and till 120 in the time period in which you did. Do you have that same confidence, though, for your grandchildren?
Oh, I do. Our grandchildren, we have two granddaughters, one of whom is 2.5, and the other of whom is, she's coming up to her first birthday. And they're unbelievably delightful. They are the most gifted and phenomenal babies ever created, of course.
What a grandfather! Yes.
Yes. No. But Julia really is. She's a Miss Personality.
You can't, but you have to see the smile on Michael's face, ear to ear. But what do you see for them as somebody who's such a proud and devoted America? Do you feel that the America that they're going to be growing up in, and they're just at the very, very beginning of what should be a long and healthy and happy life, do you see with the same confidence the America that you had?
I see it as much better.
Oh, okay.
I truly do. Now, look, this is not to say there aren't problems in America. I mean, one of the things that our granddaughters will have to encounter is this mishugas, and there's no other word for it.
That means craziness.
Right, there's no other American word for what's going on about binary, transgender, gender identity. And in other words, our granddaughters are little girls. And I understand that there are people sometimes who have dysfunctions. Right. But can we acknowledge it's a dysfunction and try to help people? I think we have a great problem today in America. And this is something that Israelis are not grateful enough for, but you should be, with homelessness. There are tent cities and homeless encampments everywhere in the United States. We've been traveling Israel. Doesn't exist here, does it? And yeah, but again, what you don't have is these huge parks filled with hundreds and hundreds of destitute, and they're usually drug addicts.
And we don't have the violence, meaning we have terrorism, and we have that element, but we don't have like what goes on in the inner city in Chicago or Detroit or some of those.
But see, this is something, and it drives me crazy, because I'm a bug for statistics, because there are very few ways that you can apprehend reality without actually, okay, let's look at the numbers. Crime is way down in America. Okay, good. In that 1968 period that we were using as a benchmark, the chances of getting murdered in Chicago were much higher than today. The murder rate in Chicago is much too high, certainly too high in Baltimore. But all across the country, we have New York City just recently, and it wasn't this last year because it went up very slightly, but New York had the lowest murder rate in 100 years. In 100 years. They've gotten better with policing. What we do have a problem with, and which is worse and undeniably worse, is the opioid. And
isn't that the number one cause of death right now in the United States?
Well, it's not the number one. It's the number one cause of death for younger people. Okay. But it's devastating if you take and first of all, when people talk about the gun deaths in America, more than 2/3, close to 3/4, are suicides. They're not homicides. Now.
Which is also a devastating statistic, and you could throw opioids in there as well, meaning people who are living in a country that most of humanity could only imagine with food and with, even though the healthcare needs fixing, there is healthcare. I mean, it's unbelievable, this, what you can get and accomplish in the United States. Yet people are one way or the other killing themselves. Yeah. How can that be? What is missing in their lives with all the Hebrew word is shefa, with all the greatness and the abundance in the States?
Well, you and I both know what's missing in the lives. It's a faith, and what comes along with faith, which is community. Is, in other words, I do believe that the core issue in most of the suicides is loneliness, is isolation. And there are relatively few married individuals, male or female, who commit suicide. And look, my wife has done several books and one best-selling book about divorce. And but even here, do you know what was the peak divorce year in America for the divorce rate? 1982. It's been straight down since 1982. And part of it is because there are fewer people getting married. And when there are fewer people getting married, however, it's also today for people who actually are able to secure a college education. And again, that's about half the young people. If a person with a college degree marries a second person with a college degree, their chances are at least 75% that they will stay married till one of them dies.
That's a fascinating statistic.
There is no 50% divorce rate. There never has been. And this is something else that I lament about America, and I have tried to make it my life's work to change, is we don't have a news business in our country. We have a bad news business. And you see it here, too. I'm experiencing this election.
If it bleeds, it leads. And the good news doesn't interest anybody.
Correct, correct. And but you also see that here is that there's a guy named Hughes who wrote a book called The Culture of Complaint. And it's just...
Or the kvetch, we might say.
The culture of kvetch is right. But you know, again, you look at this election and people are saying, it's the worst ever. It's such a disaster. All of these people are gonuffs. They're all thieves. They're all in it for themselves. They're all demagogues. They're all hopeless. What a disastrous election. Would you please look around?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Israel has never been anywhere near as prosperous, as secure, as envied by the whole world.
And as happy. We keep coming up so high on the happiness indicators, which is also reflected by the number of children that we have.
Absolutely.
The highest birth rate in the Western world. So but you get back again to that faith in family. Right. And that's what I tell people who come from the United States. There's a lot to learn from Israel. We're far from being some banana republic that the United States is being nice to just because. There's a lot to learn from this country, a lot of things that America used to have that I think we have here. And the core of that, again, I believe, is faith and family. And I think people are seeing it.
Right. And that's the one of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight with the group that's here. Because for the group, including a lot of the Jewish people who are here in the group, and the group that we're with is about 2/3 Christian, about 1/3 Jewish. But for most of them, all of them except for a couple of families, this is going to be the first real Shabbat they ever spend. And we're going to be going down and davening, praying at the Kotel at the Western Wall. And then we're going to walk back because it's Shabbat, and they're going to have the experience of coming in and sitting down, and we're going to try to sing some zemiros, at least some nigunim, some melodies that people can get for Shabbat. And really...
And Jerusalem quiets down. I mean, you'll be walking, but there won't be very many cars around. The entire city takes on a completely different atmosphere as soon as the sun goes down on Friday.
No, it does, and it's magical. Yes. And again, it truly is part of that idea. One of the things that I say to people, I begin every hour of every broadcast that I do 5 days a week. I'm giving up my normal broadcast today on Friday because Shabbat comes in here, and I can't. I am a Sabbath observer, but I begin every hour of every broadcast by saying, "And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth." Mm-hmm. And by the way, I do think America is the greatest nation, not because we're, quote, better than Israel, but partially because we're bigger and more consequential. I mean, the whole world, light in the whole world depends on the United States. Mm-hmm. And people should not only pray for Eretz Yisrael, they should pray for America, because the world desperately needs America. Mm-hmm. But we need in the world a confident America, a purposeful America. And that again is part of my work. And the whole idea of Shabbat is perspective and gratitude. One of the things that I always explain to people is the essence of the Sabbath experience is understanding the difference between the urgent and the important. And we all live under the tyranny of the urgent. We all live with this deadline and this next appointment, and we have to do this, and this is the most important thing. And not everything that's urgent is important. In fact, very little of what is urgent is really important. And what's really important is timeless, not urgent. And that's something that Shabbat comes to teach us.
And we carve that 25 hours of time into our week voluntarily and make it about something else. And so I think that's a great place to end the show. I know you've got a lot to do in the next few hours, as do I. Michael Medved, I appreciate so much you giving the time to me. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. And I hope to see you back here in the near future.
Well, God willing, very soon. This has been such a wonderful trip. And Eve, I appreciate your great work for the ideas that sustain our people and our countries, both Israel and the United States of America.
Well, thank you so much. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. You can always write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. Check out my website, eveharrow.com, for what I've been up to. And if you want to invite me to speak in your community, wherever it happens to be, drop me a line and we'll see what we can do. It's going to be a big week in Israel, so let's all pray for only good things. Take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
I call for a vote.
I'm not voting for her.
Only an idiot would vote for me.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
You should know who to vote for.
Who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election? Hi, this is Josh Haston, host of Israel Uncensored on the Land of Israel Network. Full election news and analysis that you're not going to get anywhere else. That's the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. Keep it locked in.
If you vote for me, all of your wildest dreams will